August, 480 BC. A Persian scout on horseback emerges from the mountain shadows and approaches the narrow pass of Thermopylae. His mission is simple: observe the Greek forces and report their numbers and condition to Xerxes, the king of kings, whose army stretches across the horizon like an ocean of humanity. What the scout witnesses in that moment will baffle the Persian high command and become one of the most memorable images in military history. The Greeks allow him to approach unmolested, observing him with casual indifference. And what does he see? Spartan warriors exercising naked, performing calisthenics with measured precision. Others sit calmly combing their long hair, braiding it with the care of men preparing for a wedding feast rather than certain death. Their crimson cloaks lie draped nearby, brilliant against the rocky terrain. The scout wheels his horse and gallops back to report what he's seen. When Xerxes hears the account, he bursts into laughter. These Greeks, these Spartans, they must be fools. An army exercises and grooms itself before annihilation. It's absurd. But when he consults Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king now in Persian service, the laughter dies in his throat. The former king explains with quiet gravity that when Spartans prepare their hair and bodies before battle, it means they have resolved to fight to the death. They are making themselves beautiful for their final stand. This wasn't vanity. This was ritual. This was psychological warfare at its most profound. And those crimson cloaks the scout had seen? They were about to become the most feared garment in the ancient world. To understand the terror inspired by Spartan red cloaks at Thermopylae, we must first understand what they represented. The crimson cloak, known as the phoinakes in ancient Greek, or more commonly the tribon, wasn't just a piece of military equipment. It was a statement of identity, a declaration of intent, and a weapon that struck before a single spear was thrown. The colour itself carried deep meaning. Ancient sources tell us the lawgiver Lycurgus mandated that Spartans wear crimson tunics and cloaks. The Greek historian Xenophon, writing in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, explains that this colour was chosen because it had the least resemblance to women's clothing and was most suitable for war. But there was more to it than rejecting femininity. The practical explanation often given is that red hides blood. If a Spartan warrior was wounded, the crimson would camouflage the injury, preventing the enemy from seeing weakness and preventing his own comrades from being demoralized by visible casualties. Whether this was the original intent or a later justification, the effect was real. A phalanx of bleeding Spartans could advance looking as fresh as when they started, an unnerving sight for any enemy. But the symbolism went deeper. Crimson dye in the ancient world was expensive, derived from insects and plants through laborious processes. The fact that Sparta equipped its entire citizen army with crimson cloaks demonstrated wealth and state power. This wasn't a ragtag militia in whatever clothes they could afford. This was a professional military machine, standardized and supplied by the state itself. Historical evidence suggests the Spartan government provided these cloaks as part of each warrior's standard issue uniform, much like modern militaries provide service dress. When a Spartan boy completed his training in the Agog, the brutal military education system that began at age 7, he received his full military gear including his crimson cloak. From that moment forward, the red cloak became inseparable from his identity as a Spartan warrior. According to ancient tradition, a Spartan was buried in his red cloak, the garment accompanying him into death as it had in life. This connection between the cloak and mortality was deliberate, reinforcing that to wear the crimson was to accept death as an ever-present companion. The sight of hundreds of Spartan warriors in crimson created a visual impact that ancient sources repeatedly emphasize. When battle formations assembled, the Greek phalanx already presented an intimidating spectacle. Rows of bronze-armoured men standing shoulder to shoulder, massive shields overlapping, long spears bristling forward like the spines of a great beast. But the Spartans added another element. That sea of crimson, broken only by the gleam of polished bronze and the white horsehair crests of their helmets, created an image that burned itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Ancient descriptions tell us that under the Mediterranean sun, the bronze armour would be polished to a mirror shine, and when combined with the crimson cloaks, the Spartans appeared to be warriors made of fire and blood. One ancient writer described seeing a Spartan formation approach. A wall of bronze shining fiery red in the sun, bristling with huge spears. The psychological effect on enemies waiting to receive such a charge cannot be overstated. This was visual intimidation on a massive scale. But appearance alone doesn't explain the terror inspired by those red cloaks. To understand that, we need to understand what they represented about Spartan society itself. Sparta was not like other Greek city-states. While Athens celebrated philosophy, art, and democracy, while Corinth grew rich on trade, Sparta dedicated itself entirely to one pursuit: the perfection of warfare. Spartan citizens, the Spartiates, were forbidden from engaging in trade or crafts. They could not possess gold or silver coins. They were full-time soldiers from age 7 until they were too old to fight. When other Greek armies were harvest-time militias, men who farmed or worked crafts and occasionally donned armour, the Spartans were professional warriors for whom war was not an interruption of life but life itself. Plutarch wrote that Spartans were the only men in the world for whom war brought a respite from the training for war. This total dedication created a military machine unlike anything the ancient world had seen. The crimson cloak was the visible symbol of this martial culture. When you saw a man in that distinctive red, you knew you were facing someone who had survived one of the most brutal training regimens ever devised. The aguge began at age 7 when boys were taken from their mothers and organised into packs. They were given minimal food, forcing them to steal to survive, but punished severely if caught, teaching cunning and stealth. They slept on beds of reeds they gathered themselves, wore a single cloak year-round in all weather, received minimal bathing, and underwent constant physical hardship designed to build endurance. They fought each other in brutal contests. They learned to endure pain without outcry. By the time a Spartan youth earned his crimson cloak, he had been shaped by 15 years of systematic brutality into something approaching a human weapon, and every enemy who faced him knew it. The psychological warfare began long before battle. Spartan warriors wore their hair long, a style that most other Greek city-states had abandoned for shorter cuts. For the Spartans, long hair symbolized being a free man, differentiating them from slaves. Plutarch tells us they believed long hair made handsome men more comely and ugly men more frightful. Before battle, Spartans would carefully groom this hair, often braiding it, and trim their beards neatly. This wasn't vanity in the conventional sense, it was psychological preparation and intimidation rolled into one. Ancient sources describe Spartan pre-battle rituals as elaborate grooming ceremonies. Warriors would oil their bodies until they gleamed, arrange their hair with meticulous care, sometimes adding garlands. They would ensure every piece of equipment was in perfect order. To an outside observer, especially an enemy, this behaviour was deeply unsettling. These men weren't nervous or fearful. They were preparing themselves like participants in a religious ceremony, which in a sense they were. One Spartan writer captured their philosophy. When men are about to leave their lives, they first make their heads beautiful. This acceptance of death, this ritual preparation for mortality, communicated something terrifying to enemies. You weren't facing men desperate to survive. You were facing men who had already accepted death and were now focused only on taking as many of you with them as possible. At Thermopylae, these psychological elements came together in perfect concert. Let's reconstruct that scene from the Persian perspective. Xerxes had assembled what ancient sources claim was the largest army ever gathered, drawing contingents from 46 different peoples across his vast empire. Modern historians dispute the ancient figures of millions, suggesting something closer to 100,000 to 200,000, but even at these reduced estimates, the Persian force was overwhelming. They had crushed every opposition in their path. They had bridged the Hellespont, conquered Thrace and Macedon, and now stood at the doorstep of Greece proper. The narrow pass at Thermopylae represented the last geographical barrier before the rich lands of central Greece lay open. When scouts reported that a small Greek force held the pass, Xerxes must have been more bemused than concerned. Then came that famous reconnaissance. The Persian scout approaches and the Greeks make no move to stop him. He observes the Spartans, perhaps 300 of them, going about their preparations with complete unconcern. Some exercise naked, their muscled bodies oiled and gleaming. Others sit calmly combing and braiding their long hair. Their crimson cloaks lie nearby. Massive bronze shields rest against the rebuilt Phocian wall. Long spears, the dory that was the hoplite's primary weapon, stand in neat rows. The men notice the scout but treat his presence as irrelevant, allowing him to observe and depart unmolested. When this is reported to Xerxes, his reaction is recorded by Herodotus. He found it laughable. How could warriors facing imminent destruction behave this way? It violated every logical military behavior, but Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king, explains what the King of Kings is actually seeing. These men have resolved to fight to the death. The grooming, the calisthenics, the complete lack of concern about being observed by the enemy, these are not signs of weakness or foolishness. They are signs of men who have mentally prepared themselves for their final stand. They are making their bodies beautiful before offering them to death, and those crimson cloaks, when they don them and advance, you will face the finest warriors in the world, fighting in terrain that negates your numerical advantage. Suddenly Xerxes isn't laughing anymore. He waits 4 days, expecting the Greeks to lose their nerve and retreat. They don't move. The crimson-cloaked Spartans continue their preparations with the same methodical calm. The waiting itself becomes psychological warfare. Xerxes has the largest army in the world at his command, and he's paralyzed by uncertainty because 300 men won't behave the way men facing certain death should behave. On the 5th day, Xerxes' patience breaks. He orders his troops to attack. What happens next validates every fearsome reputation those red cloaks represented. The Persians advance into the pass, which at its narrowest point is barely wide enough for 2 chariots to pass abreast. On one side rises a sheer mountain slope, on the other is the sea. The Phocian wall, rebuilt by Leonidas's forces, blocks the centre. Behind it stands the Greek phalanx, and at its core, wearing their crimson cloaks over bronze armour, are the Spartans. The first Persian troops to enter the pass are Medes and Elamites. They are brave men, experienced soldiers who have conquered from India to Egypt. But they have never faced a Greek phalanx in an environment this constrained. The phalanx was a military formation that had revolutionized ancient warfare. Hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder in ranks 8 or more deep, each man's shield protecting his left side and the right side of his neighbour. Long spears projected forward from the front ranks, creating a wall of bronze and spear points. The formation moved as a single organism, advancing with coordinated steps. Its strength lay in unity and discipline. Individual heroics meant nothing. The phalanx succeeded or failed as a collective. The Spartans had perfected this system beyond what any other Greek city-state achieved. Their professional training meant every man knew his exact position and role. They practiced complex maneuvers other armies couldn't execute: the Laconian countermarch to reverse facing when attacked from behind, the anastrophe to narrow their front and push through gaps. Most critically, they had been training together since childhood. The units often consisted of men who had been in the same training cohort, sometimes lovers according to Greek practice. They would die for each other without hesitation. When the Persians meet this formation in the confined space of Thermopylae, the result is catastrophic for the attackers. The Persian equipment was fundamentally different from Greek armour. They fought with shorter spears, bows and light armour, tactics designed for the fluid, mobile warfare of the Asian steppes and plains. In open terrain where cavalry could manoeuvre and archers could find range, these tactics were devastatingly effective. But at Thermopylae, trapped in a space so narrow their numbers became a liability, unable to use cavalry, finding their arrows largely ineffective against bronze armour and massive shields, the Persians are at every disadvantage. The Spartans, by contrast, are in their element. Herodotus describes their fighting as memorable, demonstrating skill far beyond other Greeks. They use sophisticated feints, pretending to retreat in disorder, drawing the pursuing Persians forward into overextension, then wheeling and cutting them down. Their longer spears give them reach advantage. Their heavier armour turns blows that would kill or wound a Persian. Most devastatingly, their discipline never breaks. Even as men in the front ranks fall, the ranks behind step forward seamlessly. The phalanx maintains its integrity, that bronze wall bristling with spears, never giving the Persians an opening to exploit. And through all of it, visible even through the dust and chaos of combat, are those crimson cloaks. Ancient sources emphasize how the red stood out in battle, a visible rallying point for Greeks and a marker of where the fighting was most intense for Persians. The cloaks had another psychological effect in the chaos of ancient combat. They made Spartans instantly recognizable. Friend and foe alike knew exactly who they were facing. The first day, of battle ends with Persian withdrawal, leaving the narrow pass choked with their dead. Herodotus claims the Greeks killed thousands for minimal losses of their own. On the second day, Xerxes sends his best troops, the Immortals, his elite bodyguard of 10,000 warriors, named because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000 through immediate replacement of casualties. These are the Persian king's finest soldiers, veterans of countless battles. Surely they can break through where regular troops failed. They cannot. The Spartans and their Greek allies hold the pass again. The Immortals, for all their skill and reputation, cannot overcome the fundamental problems of fighting a Greek phalanx in confined terrain. They discover what the Medes learned: longer spears, heavier armour and superior discipline in formation warfare trump individual prowess and numbers when geography constrains the battlefield. Ancient sources say Xerxes, watching from his throne, leaped up 3 times in terror for his army. The King of Kings, who rules an empire spanning 3 continents, who commands forces that have conquered seemingly the entire known world, is being held at bay by a few thousand Greeks, led by 300 Spartans in crimson cloaks. The pass holds for 2 full days. During those 2 days, something crucial happens to the Persian army's psychology. They came to Greece believing in their invincibility, having conquered nation after nation. Now they're being massacred in a narrow pass by Greeks they outnumber by orders of magnitude. And at the centre of that Greek line, unmistakable in their crimson cloaks, are the Spartans. The psychological impact spreads through the Persian camp. These aren't just skilled warriors. These are men who seemingly cannot be killed, who absorb wounds that would drop normal soldiers and keep fighting, whose formation never breaks no matter the pressure. The legend of Spartan invincibility, already established through centuries of Greek warfare, is now being validated in the most brutal fashion possible before the eyes of the entire Persian army. The red cloaks become associated with death itself. To attack that section of the line means facing those crimson-cloaked warriors, which means almost certain destruction. On the 3rd day, betrayal changes everything. A local Greek named Ephialtes informs Xerxes of a mountain path that can flank the Greek position. The Persian king sends his Immortals by night to use this path. At dawn, Leonidas learns his position has been compromised. He faces a decision. He can order a general retreat, saving his army to fight another day, or he can make a stand that he knows will end in death, but might buy crucial time for Greece to prepare its defences. Greek sources say the other contingents debated this question at a war council. Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek forces, keeping only his 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians who volunteered to stay, and 400 Thebans who Leonidas may have held as hostages due to suspected pro-Persian sympathies. Why did Leonidas and his Spartans stay when they could have retreated? Ancient sources offer multiple explanations. Herodotus suggests Leonidas believed he was fulfilling a prophecy that demanded a Spartan king's death to save Sparta. Practical military considerations also applied. A fighting retreat through the mountain passes would be chaotic and bloody, while a rearguard stand could hold the Persians long enough for the main army to escape cleanly. But there's another element that the sources capture through Spartan actions rather than explicit statements. To retreat would violate everything those crimson cloaks represented. Spartans did not run. Plutarch records that Spartan mothers told their sons to come back with their shields or on them, meaning victorious or dead, never having thrown away the heavy shield in flight. Cowardice in Sparta was perhaps the worst fate imaginable. Men accused of cowardice were excluded from holding office, forbidden from making contracts including marriage, forced to wear specially designed cloaks of mixed colours rather than the honoured crimson, and required to shave half their beards in public humiliation. A Spartan warrior would often prefer death to the shame of survival through cowardice, so Leonidas and his 300 stay. On that final morning they know exactly what awaits them. The Persians are approaching from the front through the pass and from behind via the mountain path. They are surrounded with no possibility of survival. How do they respond? By advancing beyond their defensive wall to attack the Persians in the open pass, choosing to die fighting offensively rather than waiting behind fortifications. It's an act of such aggressive courage that it stuns even the Persian forces who have come to expect the unexpected from these crimson-cloaked warriors. The final battle is less a military engagement than a ritual sacrifice. The Greeks fight with spears until the spears shatter. They fight with swords until the blades break. They fight with daggers, fists, teeth. Ancient sources say that when Leonidas falls, killed by Persian spears and arrows, the Spartans carry his body back in fighting withdrawal, 4 times driving off Persian attempts to capture it. Eventually they retreat to a small hillock in the pass, the last defensible position. Surrounded on all sides, they cluster together. The Persian archers, finally able to use their primary weapon effectively, launch volley after volley of arrows into the packed mass of men. One Spartan warrior named Dienekes, told before the battle that Persian arrows would blot out the sun, had replied, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." Now he and his companions experience the literal truth of those words as thousands of arrows darken the sky above them. Every Spartan dies. Every Thespian dies. The battle ends not because the Greeks break, not because they surrender, but because the last man capable of fighting has been killed. The Persians have won, but at a cost that shakes them. Herodotus claims 20,000 Persian dead, though modern historians consider this inflated. Even if the real figure was a fraction of that, the psychological cost was incalculable. Xerxes, furious and humiliated that his vast army took 3 days and suffered thousands of casualties to capture a pass held by a few thousand men, orders Leonidas's body found and desecrated. The Spartan king is beheaded and crucified, a violation of Greek burial customs that demonstrates the depth of Persian rage and fear. But this act of desecration backfires catastrophically. Rather than intimidating Greeks, it hardens their resolve. The crimson-cloaked Spartans who died at Thermopylae become martyrs, their sacrifice inspiring the rest of Greece to continue resistance. The delay those 3 days brought allowed the Greek fleet to position for the naval battle at Salamis, allowed Athens to evacuate its population, allowed defensive preparations that would ultimately defeat the Persian invasion. The 300 and their red cloaks achieve immortality, and with it, the terror they inspired in Persian forces spreads throughout the enemy army. After Thermopylae, Persian soldiers know exactly what those crimson cloaks mean. When they appear on a battlefield, it means you're facing warriors who will never retreat, who have been training for combat since childhood, who prefer death to shame, and whose discipline and skill make them worth several times their number in ordinary troops. This psychological impact plays out in the subsequent Greek victories. At Plataea the following year, Spartan forces are central to the Greek battle line. Persian troops who remember Thermopylae hesitate before engaging those crimson-cloaked warriors. The Spartans, fighting alongside other Greek forces, help deliver a crushing defeat that ends the Persian invasion permanently. The reputation built and reinforced at Thermopylae, that visual symbol of the red cloak connected to Spartan martial excellence, has strategic effects beyond the immediate tactical battles, but the terror inspired by Spartan red cloaks extended far beyond the Persian wars. For the next 2 centuries, those crimson-cloaked warriors dominated Greek warfare. In the complex wars between Greek city-states that followed the Persian threat, Sparta's military remained the gold standard. Athens might have the finest navy and the most sophisticated democracy, but on land, the Spartans in their distinctive red were unmatched. Other Greek states adopted red cloaks in imitation, recognizing the psychological power of that colour, but everyone knew true Spartans from the imitators. The visual impact of Spartan formations remained consistent across these centuries. Ancient descriptions from various conflicts emphasize the same elements: the polished bronze armour gleaming in the sun, the crimson cloaks, the long hair carefully maintained, the absolute discipline of movement, the way phalanx ranks dressed perfectly and moved as a single organism. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Friezes and artwork from the period show Greek warriors in cloaks, and inscriptions on monuments like the Nereid monument depict Greek soldiers identifiable as Spartans by their equipment and the presence of cloaks. The Battle of Thermopylae entered Greek consciousness as the definitive example of Spartan excellence, with those red cloaks as its most recognizable symbol. Poets and historians across the ancient world repeated the story. The epitaph for the Spartan dead, written by the poet Simonides, became one of the most famous phrases in ancient Greek. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." The monument at Thermopylae marked the location where 300 men in crimson cloaks had decided that death with honour was preferable to life with shame. But we should interrogate something important here. How much of the Spartan mystique, how much of the terror inspired by those red cloaks, was based on genuine military superiority versus propaganda and psychological manipulation? This is a crucial question because the Spartans were master brand managers. They cultivated their image with the same dedication they cultivated their military skills. The ancient sources we rely on for Spartan history are problematic. Herodotus, writing decades after Thermopylae, collected stories from survivors and witnesses but couldn't verify everything. Xenophon was an admirer of Sparta, writing what amounts to propaganda praising their system. Plutarch wrote centuries after the height of Spartan power, drawing on sources that themselves had agendas. The Spartans left a little writing themselves. They preferred to let their actions speak and carefully controlled what outsiders knew of their society. So when we talk about the terror inspired by red cloaks, we're partly talking about real military effectiveness and partly about deliberately cultivated mythology. That said, the military effectiveness was undeniably real. The numbers don't lie. Sparta remained the dominant land power in Greece for nearly 200 years after Thermopylae. When Spartan forces took the field, they won far more often than they lost. The training system that created those crimson-cloaked warriors produced soldiers whose discipline and skill exceeded every contemporary force. The phalanx formation, which all Greeks used, was executed by Spartans with a precision others couldn't match. Even critics of Sparta, of which there were many in democratic Athens, acknowledged Spartan military excellence. Thucydides, the great Athenian historian, has his Athenians say that Spartan training was worth more than all their own words. That's a remarkable admission from a society that prided itself on rhetoric and philosophy. So the terror was built on substance. Those crimson cloaks didn't just look intimidating. They marked warriors who had earned their fearsome reputation through consistent battlefield success. The psychological warfare elements we've discussed, the grooming before battle, the calm acceptance of death, the long hair and polished equipment, these worked because they were genuine rather than theatrical. The Spartans really did prepare this way. They really did prefer death to dishonour. When Leonidas and his 300 stayed at Thermopylae to die rather than retreat, this wasn't an anomaly. It was exactly consistent with Spartan values. Future generations of Spartan warriors knew this history and internalized it. When you put on that crimson cloak, you were joining a tradition of men who had proven they would never break, never run, never surrender. That knowledge affected your behaviour, made you fight harder, stand longer, endure more. And enemies who knew this history saw those red cloaks and understood they were facing warriors conditioned from childhood to embody these values. The psychological impact was circular and self-reinforcing. The reputation created the reality, and the reality reinforced the reputation. Modern military historians studying ancient warfare have concluded that the Spartan system, for all its brutality, produced perhaps the finest heavy infantry of the ancient Mediterranean world. Their training emphasized exactly the skills needed for phalanx warfare: endurance over speed, discipline over individual initiative, unit cohesion over personal glory. The Argos deliberately stripped away individuality and created men who functioned best as part of a collective. This was perfect for a military system where success depended on maintaining formation integrity under extreme pressure. Other Greek city-states trained their citizens for war, but those citizens were primarily farmers or craftsmen who occasionally fought. Spartans were full-time warriors whose entire society was organized around maintaining military readiness. The economic system, based on Helot slavery, freed citizens for constant military training. The social system, which removed boys from family life and raised them communally, created bonds between warriors that exceeded normal friendship. The political system, which limited Spartan kings' power during peacetime but gave them absolute authority in war, ensured military decisions weren't delayed by democratic debate. All of this fed into the effectiveness of those crimson-cloaked warriors. When they took the field, they brought not just individual training but systemic advantages. They were better equipped because the state provided standardized gear. They were better trained because they'd been training together since childhood. They were more motivated because their entire cultural identity centered on martial excellence. And they were more disciplined because failure meant not just military defeat, but social death, exile from the only community they'd ever known. These advantages were visible to enemies in ways that are hard for modern people to fully appreciate. In ancient warfare, before battles often there would be a period where armies could observe each other. During this time, the visual impact of forces was crucial. A disorganized, poorly equipped militia in mismatched gear communicated weakness. A Spartan phalanx in formation, crimson cloaks over polished bronze, moving with synchronized precision, communicated overwhelming strength. Enemies could see the difference and had to steel themselves to face it. At Thermopylae, these psychological elements achieved their fullest expression. The Persians had every reason to be confident. They had conquered most of the known world. Their forces outnumbered the Greeks by possibly 50 to 1 or more. They had better cavalry, more diverse troops, more experience with large-scale warfare. But psychology warfare doesn't follow the logic of numbers and equipment. When that Persian scout returned and reported men calmly grooming themselves for death, when Xerxes learned those 300 crimson-cloaked warriors fully intended to fight until none remained alive, something shifted in the confidence of the invading army. Modern military psychology recognizes that soldiers' effectiveness is heavily influenced by their expectations and beliefs. Troops who believe they're invincible, even with modest equipment and training, will often defeat technically superior forces who doubt their abilities. The Spartans at Thermopylae believed absolutely in their superiority. Not just believed, but knew, because everything in their training and experience confirmed it. They had been preparing for exactly this scenario since age 7. They had seen older warriors return from battles with stories of victory. They knew the history of Spartan dominance. Most importantly, they had internalized the cultural values that made death preferable to failure. The Persians, despite their vast numbers, didn't have this psychological certainty. They were a diverse coalition, many nations pressed into service, fighting for an emperor rather than for home. They'd succeeded through overwhelming force more often than through superior warrior quality. When they encountered an enemy that couldn't be overwhelmed, that wouldn't break psychologically no matter the pressure, their entire strategic approach faltered. The red cloaks became the visible symbol of this immovable resistance. As casualties mounted in the pass, as attack after attack shattered against the Greek phalanx, those crimson-cloaked Spartans standing firm in the centre of the line became the focal point of Persian fear. They couldn't be going around them because geography prevented it. They couldn't be broken because Spartan discipline and training was too complete. They could only be killed, one at a time, at enormous cost. This is the ultimate expression of psychological warfare, creating a situation where the enemy's numerical advantage becomes psychologically meaningless because they can't figure out how to apply it effectively. After Thermopylae, Persian forces had to continue south into Greece, but they did so with shaken confidence. Yes, they'd eventually won the battle, but at what cost? 3 days to force a narrow pass, 20,000 dead, or 10,000, or even 5,000, whatever the real figure was, seemed like far too high a price for such a minor tactical objective, and they'd only succeeded through betrayal, not by breaking the Greek line in fair combat. Worse, the Spartans and their allies had chosen when to die. They'd fought, and fallen on their own terms. Xerxes could desecrate Leonidas's body, but everyone knew this was impotent rage, an admission that he'd been psychologically defeated by 300 men in crimson cloaks. The subsequent Greek victories at Salamis and Plataea were certainly won by superior tactics and fortunate circumstances, but the psychological foundation was laid at Thermopylae. The Greeks knew they could resist. The Persians knew the Greeks would resist. Those 3 days at the pass, dominated by the image of Spartan red cloaks standing unmovable against the Persian tide, changed the psychological balance of the entire war. We should take a moment to consider the cloaks themselves as physical objects. The crimson dye, madder red specifically, was derived from the roots of the Rubia tinctorum plant. Producing this dye required significant labour, harvesting roots, processing them through multiple stages, achieving consistent coloration. The process had been refined over centuries across the Mediterranean world, and Sparta had access to trade networks that supplied the necessary materials or completed cloth. The cloaks themselves were woolen, essential for Greece's climate where winters could be cold in the mountains but summers were hot. Wool regulates temperature reasonably well and continues to insulate even when wet. The style was relatively simple compared to elaborate Persian garments, a rectangular piece of cloth, worn draped over one shoulder or both depending on circumstance, fastened with pins or brooches. On the march or in camp, the cloak provided warmth and protection from elements. Before battle, it would be removed because it could restrict movement or provide enemies something to grab. But that moment of removing the cloak, of revealing the polished bronze armour underneath, became part of the pre-battle ritual. First, the enemy sees the crimson mass. Then as the battle approaches, the cloaks come off to reveal the bronze armour, creating a visual transformation that emphasized the Spartans' readiness for combat. Archaeological evidence for Spartan military equipment is frustratingly limited because Sparta didn't build elaborate temples or monuments the way Athens did. Much of what we think we know comes from literary sources and artistic representations, but enough physical evidence exists to confirm basic details. Helmet types used by Spartans evolved over time from the fully enclosed Corinthian style to simpler forms like the pylos cap, prioritizing visibility and hearing over complete protection. Shields, the famous aspis or hoplon, were large, round, heavy wooden frames covered in bronze with arm straps and a grip. Spears were typically 8 to 10 feet long. Body armor varied from the bronze bell cuirass to later linen laminate armor. All of this equipment was expensive, which is why hoplite warfare was originally limited to property-owning citizens who could afford to equip themselves. Sparta's system of helot slavery freed citizens from economic production, allowing the state to provide equipment. That crimson cloak, therefore, wasn't just fabric. It was a marker of citizenship in a state that could afford to outfit its warrior class uniformly. The contrast with Persian equipment enhanced the visual impact. Persian troops wore diverse gear representing their various subject peoples. Some contingents had bronze armor, others wore leather or cloth reinforced with metal scales, many wore no armor at all. Shields varied from small wicker constructions to larger forms. Weapons included bows, javelins, short swords, spears of various lengths, clubs. This diversity was actually a strength in many situations, allowing the Persian command to deploy the right troops for specific tasks. But at Thermopylae, it worked against them visually and psychologically. The Persian army looked like what it was, a coalition of many peoples pressed into service. The Greek army, with the Spartans at its core, looked unified and purposeful. That sea of crimson cloaks communicated unity, standardization, professionalism. Even though Greek forces at Thermopylae included contingents from multiple city-states, the Spartans' distinctive appearance made them the visual and psychological center. Ancient battles were chaotic, confusing affairs full of dust, noise, and fear. In that chaos, being able to identify your comrades was crucial for maintaining formation. The crimson cloaks served this purpose for Spartans, allowing them to locate each other in the melee. But they also allowed enemies to identify Spartans, which cut both ways. On one hand, it allowed Persian commanders to try to avoid or concentrate forces against those positions. On the other hand, it meant Persian soldiers knew exactly where the toughest fighting would be, which likely made them hesitant to engage those positions. The long-term legacy of Spartan red cloaks and their psychological impact at Thermopylae extended far beyond ancient warfare. The battle became one of the most referenced events in Western military history. The image of 300 warriors making a last stand against impossible odds resonated across cultures and centuries. That they wore distinctive red cloaks became inseparable from the legend. Fast forward to modern times, and we see Thermopylae referenced constantly in military academies worldwide as a case study in the power of defensive terrain, tactical excellence, and psychological warfare. The red cloaks appear in every modern retelling, from scholarly histories to popular films, because they serve as such a perfect visual symbol of everything the battle represented. When Frank Miller created his graphic novel 300 in 1998, later adapted into the 2006 film, the crimson cloaks featured prominently in the stylized imagery. While these modern interpretations take enormous liberties with historical accuracy, they understood intuitively what ancient sources tell us. Those red cloaks were central to the psychological impact of Spartan warriors. But we should trace the evolution of Spartan military culture beyond Thermopylae to understand how that initial terror inspired by crimson cloaks played out across subsequent decades. The Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, just 1 year after Thermopylae, saw the largest deployment of Spartan forces in the Persian Wars. 10,000 Spartiates took the field, along with their attendant helots and perioikoi, non-citizen free men who fought alongside Spartans. The Greek historian Herodotus describes the Spartan contingent as the most splendid he had ever seen, emphasizing their equipment and appearance. When the Persians observed the Spartan formation taking position on the battlefield, they understood immediately what they faced. The memories of Thermopylae were fresh. Persian commanders knew those crimson-cloaked warriors would not break, would not retreat, would fight with skill and discipline beyond any other Greek contingent. At Plataea, the psychological warfare element played out differently than at Thermopylae. The battle was fought on open ground, not in a confined pass, which theoretically should have favoured the more numerous and diverse Persian forces. But when the Persian general Mardonius launched his best troops, including the Immortals, against the Spartan position, he discovered that what happened at Thermopylae wasn't an artifact of geography. The Spartans were simply better infantry. They held formation under intense pressure, then counterattacked, breaking the Persian line and killing Mardonius himself. Ancient sources emphasize that this victory was won primarily by Spartan excellence, with the distinctive red cloaks visible throughout the fiercest fighting. The other Greek contingents, who had watched the Spartans at Thermopylae become legends, now witnessed Spartan dominance in open battle. This reinforced the psychological impact. The red cloaks meant victory, almost regardless of circumstances. The psychological terror inspired by Spartan warriors reached its peak in the decades following the Persian Wars. Between 479 BC and the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BC, Sparta faced no serious military defeats. Their land army was effectively unbeatable. Other Greek city-states organized their foreign policies around the assumption that fighting Spartans directly was suicidal. Athens built its power through naval supremacy specifically because they couldn't challenge Sparta on land. The Peloponnesian League, Sparta's alliance system, held together largely because member states feared Spartan military intervention more than they resented Spartan hegemony. When diplomatic disputes arose between Greek city-states, the question, "Will this bring Spartan hoplites to our territory?" often determined decisions. Those crimson cloaks had become synonymous with military invincibility. Thucydides provides remarkable insight into how this psychological dominance functioned in his account of the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. Before the battle, he describes the approach of the Spartan army. They advanced slowly into the music of many flute players in their ranks, not as an act of piety, but to make them advance evenly and keep time in their march without breaking formation. The visual and auditory spectacle was deliberately designed for psychological impact. The crimson cloaks, the bronze armour polished to reflection, the perfect formation maintained across difficult terrain, the sound of flutes rather than war cries, all of it communicated supreme confidence and discipline. Enemy forces watching this approach had to overcome not just the tactical reality of facing excellent troops, but the psychological weight of Sparta's undefeated reputation. Thucydides notes that the Spartans' enemies at Mantinea were alarmed at the sight of the approaching phalanx. This fear was rational. The Spartans won decisively, their formation never wavering, their crimson-cloaked ranks advancing through enemy positions like an unstoppable machine. The Peloponnesian War itself demonstrates both the power and limitations of Spartan psychological warfare. Athens and its allies, despite their fear of Spartan land forces, challenged Sparta's overall dominance because they recognized that Spartan excellence was specifically in hoplite warfare. Athenian strategy, articulated by Pericles, was to avoid land battles while using naval superiority to raid Spartan territory and maintain their maritime empire. When Spartan armies invaded Attica repeatedly in the early war years, the Athenians simply retreated behind their walls and refused battle. This frustrated the Spartans enormously because their greatest weapon, the psychological terror of facing their crimson-cloaked phalanx, was neutralized if enemies wouldn't fight. The red cloaks could intimidate on a battlefield but couldn't force enemies to appear on that battlefield in the first place. However, when land battles did occur during the Peloponnesian War, Spartan dominance remained evident. At the Battle of Nemea in 394 BC, part of the Corinthian War, Spartan forces faced a coalition of Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and Argos. Despite being outnumbered, the Spartans won through superior discipline and tactical sophistication. Ancient sources describe how the Spartan right wing, the position of honour typically occupied by the best troops, crushed the opposing left wing, then wheeled to attack the enemy centre and remaining wing from the side. This manoeuvre, extraordinarily difficult to execute in the chaos of ancient battle, required every hoplite to maintain formation while changing direction, advancing at measured pace, and engaging new enemies without individual units becoming isolated or disordered. The Spartans executed it flawlessly, their commanders singing orders, their crimson-cloaked ranks moving like parts of a single organism. Enemies watching this manoeuvre understood they were facing something beyond ordinary military competence. This was the result of a lifetime of training, beginning in childhood, focused entirely on mastering collective infantry warfare. The terror inspired by Spartan red cloaks began to crack only in the 370s BC, more than a century after Thermopylae. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC marks the watershed moment. Epaminondas of Thebes, one of the most innovative military commanders in Greek history, had studied Spartan tactics extensively and devised a strategy to counter them. He concentrated his best troops, the Sacred Band of Thebes, on his left wing in a column 50 ranks deep, rather than the traditional 8 to 12 ranks. This massive column struck the Spartan right wing, the position where Sparta's king and best warriors fought. For the first time in living memory, a Spartan formation broke. The Spartan king Cleombrotus was killed. 700 Spartiates died on that field, a catastrophic loss for a state that could field only a few thousand full citizens. The psychological impact of Leuctra was devastating, not just for Sparta, but for the entire Greek world. The invincible warriors in crimson cloaks had been beaten decisively. Ancient sources describe a sense of shock that rippled through Greece. Xenophon, who was present in the region though not at the battle itself, records the disbelief when news arrived. The myth of Spartan invincibility, built over centuries and symbolized by those red cloaks, shattered in a single afternoon. Theban forces followed up by invading Spartan territory itself, something unthinkable before Leuctra. They marched through the Spartan heartland, and for the first time, enemies saw the contradictions in Spartan society. A tiny warrior elite controlling a massive enslaved helot population through terror. Epaminondas liberated Messenia, freeing the helots who provided the economic foundation for Spartan military dominance. Without helot labour, Spartan citizens couldn't maintain their full-time military lifestyle. After Leuctra, Sparta never recovered its dominant position. The Crimson Cloak still inspired respect, but no longer paralysing fear. When Spartan forces appeared on battlefields in subsequent decades, enemies engaged them cautiously, but didn't assume defeat was inevitable. The psychological terror had required constant reinforcement, through victory. Once broken, it couldn't be restored. By the time Philip II of Macedon began unifying Greece under Macedonian hegemony in the mid-4th century, Sparta was a secondary power, still respected for its history but no longer dominant. Philip famously sent a message to Sparta asking whether he should come as friend or foe, to which the Spartans replied with a single word: neither. Philip invaded Spartan territory, defeated their forces, and when he offered relatively generous terms, the Spartans' terse response couldn't hide that their military mystique was gone. The red cloaks still marked Spartan identity, but they no longer guaranteed victory. Yet the legacy of those crimson cloaks and what they represented at Thermopylae extended far beyond Sparta's military power. The story became embedded in Western culture, as the archetypal tale of heroic last stands. The details evolved and were embellished over centuries, but certain elements remained constant. The small force of defenders, the vast attacking army, the narrow pass, the 3-day battle, and those distinctive red cloaks. Roman writers like Cicero and Plutarch referenced Thermopylae when discussing virtue and courage. The epitaph "Go tell the Spartans" was translated into Latin and became a common memorial phrase. Early Christian writers found parallels between Spartan sacrifice at Thermopylae and Christian martyrdom, both involving willing death for a higher cause. Medieval and Renaissance Europe rediscovered classical texts and seized upon Thermopylae as an exemplar of martial virtue. Knights and nobles saw in Spartan warriors a mirror of their own ideals: dedication to warfare, honour preferring death to shame, loyalty to comrades above personal survival. The red cloaks became a standard element in artistic depictions of the battle. Painters and sculptors showed Leonidas and his Spartans in crimson, even when other historical details were rendered inaccurately. The colour itself took on symbolic meaning beyond its historical reality: red for blood, for sacrifice, for martial valour. When European military forces adopted distinctive unit colours in later centuries, they often referenced the Spartan example. British redcoats, French Revolutionary red bonnets, various elite units in red uniforms, all drew consciously or unconsciously on the tradition of crimson-clad warriors representing military excellence. The Enlightenment brought more critical historical analysis, but also renewed fascination with Sparta. Philosophers debated whether Spartan society represented an ideal of civic virtue or a dystopian military state. Jean-Jacques Rousseau admired Spartan education for producing dedicated citizens. Voltaire criticized Spartan society as barbaric and culturally sterile. But both acknowledged Thermopylae as militarily remarkable. The red cloaks appeared in Enlightenment artwork and literature as symbols of dutiful citizenship and self-sacrifice for the state. Revolutionary. France, seeking historical precedents for civic virtue, repeatedly referenced Thermopylae. Jacques-Louis David's painting Leonidas at Thermopylae, completed in 1814, shows the Spartan king and his warriors in their final moments, crimson cloaks draped dramatically, embodying neoclassical ideals of heroic nudity and martial readiness. The 19th century saw Thermopylae thoroughly integrated into Western military culture and education. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst taught the battle as a lesson in defensive tactics and leadership. The emphasis shifted somewhat from pure heroic sacrifice to analysing Leonidas' strategic decisions, his choice of defensive position, his use of the Phocian wall, his decision to dismiss most Allied forces before the final stand. But the visual elements remained central to how the battle was remembered. Textbooks illustrated Spartan warriors in their distinctive gear, always emphasizing the crimson cloaks. The colour became shorthand for Spartan identity in a way that made it impossible to discuss the battle without mentioning those red garments. Modern archaeology and historiography have brought more rigour to understanding what actually happened at Thermopylae, stripping away some of the mythology while confirming core elements. The past has changed significantly over 2,500 years due to geological processes depositing alluvial soil, so the ancient battlefield was quite different from the modern landscape. The Hot Gates, the narrowest point, was genuinely as constricted as ancient sources claimed, making it an excellent defensive position. Archaeological surveys have found evidence of the Phocian wall that Leonidas rebuilt and defended. Analysis of ancient weapons and armour confirms the advantages Greek hoplite equipment had over typical Persian gear in close combat. Studies of military logistics have revised estimates of Persian army size downward from the millions claimed by Herodotus. But even at 100,000 to 200,000 troops, the numerical disparity was overwhelming. What archaeology can't capture is the psychological dimension, yet this may have been the most important aspect of Thermopylae's impact. We can analyse armour thickness and spear length, calculate march rates and supply requirements, model phalanx dynamics and casualty rates. But we can't quantify the effect of seeing 300 men calmly preparing for death, or the terror inspired by crimson-cloaked warriors who never broke formation, or the propaganda value of a heroic last stand that inspired an entire civilization to continue resistance. These psychological elements, symbolized by those red cloaks, determined the battle's historical significance far more than its modest tactical importance. Modern military theorists recognize psychological warfare as a distinct domain of conflict. The term force multiplier describes factors that make a military unit more effective than its numbers and equipment alone would suggest: morale, training, unit cohesion, leadership, and reputation all function as force multipliers. The Spartans at Thermopylae demonstrated every one of these factors, operating at maximum effectiveness. Their training was unmatched, their unit cohesion perfected through childhood socialization, their leadership exemplary in Leonidas' decisions, and their reputation preceded them. The crimson cloak served as the visible symbol tying all these elements together. When Persian scouts reported men in red cloaks performing calisthenics and grooming their hair, they were reporting a force multiplier that couldn't be countered through superior numbers or equipment. The question remains, was the terror inspired by Spartan red cloaks at Thermopylae primarily substance or primarily perception management? The answer is both, operating in symbiotic relationship. The substance was real. Spartan military training and social organization produced genuinely superior infantry by the standards of ancient Greek warfare. Their performance at Thermopylae and in subsequent battles confirmed this superiority repeatedly. But perception management was equally important. The Spartans cultivated mystery about their society, allowing outsiders to see only what served Spartan interests. They developed distinctive visual markers like the crimson cloaks and long hair that made them instantly recognizable. They created rituals like the pre-battle grooming that communicated psychological messages to enemies. They established a culture where death was preferable to shame, ensuring that reputation for never retreating or surrendering became self-fulfilling. The terror worked because it was earned through consistent performance, but it also worked because the Spartans understood how to amplify and broadcast that performance. The crimson cloaks weren't chosen randomly. Red was selected for its visibility, its association with blood and warfare, its expense signalling state power. The decision to wear hair long wasn't mere tradition. It served as a marker of free citizenship and made warriors more visually striking. The pre-battle grooming wasn't pointless ritual. It communicated acceptance of death in ways that deeply unsettled enemies who hoped opponents would panic or flee. Every element of Spartan military culture was designed to function both practically and psychologically. This integration of substance and perception management is what made the terror inspired by those red cloaks so effective and long-lasting. Thermopylae represents the perfect expression of this integration, because everything came together in one concentrated moment. The terrain maximized Spartan tactical advantages while minimizing Persian numerical superiority. The political circumstances gave the battle existential significance for Greek civilization. Leonidas's decision to stay provided a narrative of ultimate sacrifice. The 3-day duration allowed the battle to become a sustained demonstration of Spartan excellence rather than a brief skirmish, and throughout it all those crimson cloaks remained visible, marking the warriors who held the pass through sheer skill and determination. When the last Spartan fell on that final hillock, killed by Persian arrows because he could no longer defend himself, the red cloak he wore carried the full weight of Spartan military culture, Leonidas's leadership, 3 days of savage fighting, and centuries of accumulated reputation. The legacy of Thermopylae and its crimson cloak defenders shapes how we think about military culture even today. Special forces units worldwide emphasize many of the same elements the Spartans perfected. Intensive training from an early age, unit cohesion developed through shared hardship, distinctive visual identifiers, reputations that precede deployment, psychological operations as integral to military effectiveness. The specific forms differ radically. Modern military science has moved far beyond ancient phalanx warfare, but the underlying principles remain surprisingly consistent. Elite military units still understand that combat effectiveness depends on training, cohesion, morale, and reputation, the same factors that made those crimson-cloaked Spartans so formidable 2,500 years ago. When we see modern depictions of Thermopylae, whether in scholarly works or popular entertainment, those red cloaks inevitably appear because they serve as visual shorthand for everything the battle represented. They tell us immediately these are Spartans, these are professional warriors, these are men who will not break or retreat. That a piece of coloured cloth could carry such weight speaks to the power of cultural symbolism and psychological warfare. The Spartans understood something fundamental about human psychology, that symbols properly deployed and consistently reinforced can achieve effects that weapons and tactics alone cannot. Those crimson cloaks, visible in the dust and chaos of Thermopylae, communicated messages that transcended language and culture, messages about commitment, excellence, and the willingness to die rather than fail. That these messages still resonate across 25 centuries testifies to how effectively the Spartans integrated military substance with psychological warfare, creating a legend that outlived their empire by millennia.